The stepmother forces the millionaire's daughter to eat in the rain, but she doesn't imagine. The father arrives at that exact moment. He sees everything and does something so unexpected that leaves her in shock and remorseful. She's not able to eat here, Mommy. The estate, one of the many assets that comprised the vast fortune of her father, Richard, was a sleeping giant under the soft drizzle that fell on that Tuesday afternoon. To little Lena, just 10 years old, the marble walls and perfectly manicured gardens seemed more a frame for silence than a home. Every corridor echoed the absence of her father, a man whose fortune grew in distant markets through investments in stocks and crypto, but whose presence became increasingly rare. The opulence of the house, with its crystal chandeliers and Persian rugs, only accentuated the emptiness the girl felt in her chest, a space once filled by the warm smile of her late mother. Now, the rules were dictated by Veronica, Richard's new wife, a woman of sculpted beauty and an icy composure that chilled Lena to the bone. Veronica managed the house with the precision of someone running a high-stakes business, where every detail, every gesture was meticulously controlled. Love, to her, seemed like an asset that only yielded dividends if paired with blind obedience. That night's dinner was a perfect example. The silence at the table was broken only by the faint clinking of silver cutlery against porcelain. Lena ate with extreme care, her eyes fixed on her plate, feeling Veronica's gaze weigh on her shoulders. The stepmother didn't need to raise her voice. Her power lay in subtlety, in a raised eyebrow, in a sigh of disapproval. One wrong move, a slip of her fork, and a tiny drop of red sauce stained the immaculate white linen tablecloth, imported from Italy. It was a minuscule, almost imperceptible accident, but to Veronica, it was an affront. Her thin lips curled into a smile utterly devoid of warmth. "Respect, Lena. It is the foundation of everything," she said, her voice calm and cutting. "You need to learn to value the things we have, to respect this home." Lena mumbled an apology, her eyes welling up, but Veronica was already standing. "You won't learn your lesson sitting comfortably inside here." The girl's heart hammered. She knew what was coming next. It was a cruelty disguised as discipline, a punishment that was becoming increasingly frequent. With unshakable firmness, Veronica picked up Lena's plate and walked toward the glass door that led to the garden. The rain was now falling more heavily, its drops hammering the leaves of the magnolias. "Finish your meal outside," she ordered, her voice devoid of emotion. "Perhaps the cold will help you remember the value of a warm roof and a properly set table." Lena trembled, not just from fear, but from the humiliation that consumed her. She followed her stepmother, her bare feet feeling the chill of the marble floor. The door opened, and the smell of wet earth invaded the dining room. Veronica handed her the plate and closed the door, drawing the heavy silk curtains immediately afterward, blocking the view of the scene that would unfold in the garden. Outside, the fine rain began to soak her dress and hair, mixing with the silent tears rolling down her face. She tried to take a bite of the now cold, watery food while the wind whipped around her. What she didn't know was that, in one of the upstairs windows, a pair of eyes was watching everything. Eleanor, the housekeeper who had worked for the family for over 20 years, saw the girl huddled in the downpour and brought a hand to her mouth, her face twisted in a mixture of pity and dread. She had a choice to make: intervene and risk her employment, or remain silent and allow the injustice to continue. Eleanor remained motionless by the window, the dishcloth she held twisted in her wrinkled hands. Every drop of rain that ran down the glass seemed like a tear for the girl outside, a child paying a disproportionate price for an insignificant mistake. The housekeeper, who had seen Richard born and had cared for his first wife with an almost maternal affection, felt her heart constricted by an anguish that suffocated her. Going downstairs, opening that door, and confronting Veronica was what her conscience screamed for, but fear paralyzed her. Losing that job meant more than losing an income source. It meant abandoning the house that had been her refuge for decades. It meant leaving Lena entirely at the woman's mercy. Veronica was the new lady of the house, the administrator of a small domestic empire financed by her husband's immense fortune, and her power inside was absolute. With a heavy sigh, Eleanor moved away from the window, the bitter decision to remain silent weighing on her soul like an anchor. Lena's solitude, at that moment, became hers too. The night dragged on, cold and damp. When dawn broke, a pale mist still hung over the gardens. Eleanor found Lena in her room, curled up under the feather duvet, her small body shaking uncontrollably. The girl's forehead burned with fever, and her breathing was a weak, wheezing sound. The housekeeper prepared hot tea and placed a cold compress on her forehead, her heart aching with guilt. It was then that the sound of Richard's car echoed in the driveway. He had returned early from a business trip, a rare surprise that, for an instant, ignited a flame of hope in Eleanor's chest. Richard entered the house with his usual energy, the man accustomed to commanding board meetings and multiplying his capital with rapid decisions. Not seeing his daughter at breakfast, he went straight up to her room. He found her pale, her large, feverish eyes fixed on the ceiling. "My angel, what happened?" he asked, genuine concern in his voice, sitting on the edge of the bed and touching her warm face. Before Lena could whisper a single word, Veronica's figure appeared in the doorway, impeccably dressed, carrying a tray of medicines. Her face displayed a mask of sweet, maternal concern. "Darling, you're back. What a wonderful surprise," she said, her voice soft as velvet. "Our little adventurer here decided it would be a great idea to play in the rain yesterday. I warned her, but you know how children are." The lie was delivered with disconcerting naturalness, a serene smile that would disarm anyone. Richard, whose mind was always occupied with the ups and downs of the stock market and the management of his countless businesses, sighed, accepting the explanation without question. It was simpler, faster. "Lena, you need to take care of yourself," he said, kissing his daughter's forehead. "Daddy needs to head to another meeting, but I want you well soon." Lena merely watched him, her throat closed by a knot of despair. Veronica's words echoed in her mind, erasing the truth with cruel ease. Her father, her hero, had believed the lie. She was completely alone. Richard left the room, already on the phone discussing interest rates and investment portfolios. Veronica adjusted Lena's pillows with a gesture that seemed caring, but her eyes held a glint of triumph. "Rest, sweetie. You'll be better soon," she whispered, before withdrawing and leaving the girl to sink into the solitude of her silent room. The hope that had arisen with her father's arrival dissolved into dust. She understood, with the painful clarity that only injustice teaches, that no one would speak up for her. If she wanted the truth to come out, she would have to find a way herself. As the fever made her delirious, an idea began to form in her mind. Her father's office, the books he loved so much. One of them, in particular, an antique, leather-bound volume of classic fairy tales that her mother used to read to her. It had to be there, weak in body, but with renewed determination. Lena waited for the house to sink into the quiet of the afternoon. She needed a piece of paper and a pen. She needed to leave a trail, a message that money could not buy and that a lie could not erase. The fever came and went in waves, leaving Lena weak and sweating, but the determination burned stronger. She waited, listening to the sounds of the mansion, learning its rhythms. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway was the pulse of the house, marking the time that dragged on. She heard Veronica on the phone in the living room, her controlled voice discussing the organization of a charity gala, an exercise in public image that contrasted brutally with her private tyranny. She heard Eleanor's soft footsteps in the kitchen, the familiar sound of dishes being washed. She needed to act in the brief interval when the housekeeper would be in the back of the house, attending to the laundry, and Veronica was distracted in her world of appearances. The opportunity arose in the middle of the afternoon. With her body aching, Lena slipped out of bed, her feet touching the cold floor. Every step was an effort, her head spinning slightly, but the image of her disappointed father's face, believing the lie, propelled her forward. The hallway seemed endless. The oil paintings on the walls, part of her father's valuable art collection, seemed to observe her with severe eyes. She crept to the door of the office, a sanctuary of business and figures she was rarely allowed to enter. The brass doorknob turned silently. Inside, the smell of leather and paper dominated the air. Richard's enormous mahogany desk was covered with documents, reports on his company's cash flow, and charts showing the profitability of his assets. On one of the computer screens, stock quotes and foreign currencies flickered, a constant reminder of the fortune that surrounded her yet brought her no security. Her father's world was made of dollars, euros, and the volatile promise of Bitcoin, an abstract universe distant from her small reality of pain. But on one wall, between diplomas and awards, was a bookshelf, and there, amid volumes on economics and wealth management, it sat, a blue hardback book with gold letters worn by time, Tales from the Shaded Glade. With trembling hands, Lena took the book. Her heart raced. The smell of the pages was the smell of her childhood, of the nights her mother held her close and read about fairies and brave heroes. It was the most valuable inheritance she possessed, more precious than all the gold stored in her father's vaults. On a small notepad on the desk, she wrote with her childish handwriting, slightly shaky from the fever. The words were simple, direct, born from the depths of her wounded soul. Daddy. It wasn't playing, the rain. She made me eat outside and I got cold. I miss you. Love, Lena. She didn't use Veronica's name. Fear still paralyzed her, but the message was clear. She carefully folded the small paper and hid it between the pages of The Firebird, her mother's favorite story. It was a small investment of courage, a seed of truth planted in the hope that it might flourish. She put the book back in its place, trying to leave it exactly as it was. The effort left her exhausted. As she turned to leave, she heard the unmistakable sound of Veronica's heels on the marble floor of the corridor, approaching. Panic froze her, quick and silent as a mouse. She hid behind the heavy velvet curtain, holding her breath, her heart pounding against her ribs. The office door opened slowly. Veronica didn't step in, only scanned the room, a routine inspection. Her sharp eyes swept the desk, the screens, and then, for an instant that felt like an eternity to Lena, rested on the bookshelf. The stepmother's gaze lingered on the blue spine of the storybook, an indecipherable expression on her face. She seemed to hesitate, as if an instinct warned her that something was out of place. Lena's heart felt ready to leap from her mouth. Hidden behind the heavy curtain, she barely dared to breathe, each second stretching into a silent agony. Veronica's eyes, cold and calculating, remained fixed on the shelf, scrutinizing every detail. For a moment, Lena was certain she would be discovered. She imagined the stepmother's contained fury, the punishment that would follow, much worse than the rain. But, as suddenly as it arose, Veronica's hesitation dissipated. She shrugged, as if dismissing an annoying thought, and closed the office door, her footsteps receding down the corridor. Lena let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her body trembling with adrenaline. She waited another minute, which felt like a lifetime, before emerging from her hiding place and scurrying back to her room, diving under the safety of her covers. The note was safe. The seed of truth had been planted. Now, all that remained was to wait for her father to find it. In the next 2 days, the mansion operated in its cold, calculated normalcy. Lena's fever broke, leaving her with a persistent weakness and a dry cough. Veronica, perhaps sensing she had gone too far or simply to maintain appearances, adopted an attitude of exemplary care. She brought her fresh juices and soups, read fashion magazines aloud by her bedside, and spoke about her plans for the future, a future where she and Lena would be the best of friends. It was a masterful performance, a web of manipulation woven with threads of kindness and false smiles. Lena, however, was not fooled. She responded with monosyllables and accepted the gestures with a passivity that Veronica interpreted as submission. But inside, the girl was a fortress of hope, awaiting the moment her father would open that blue book. She imagined him reading the note, the initial confusion giving way to understanding, and finally, the righteous anger of a father protecting his daughter. The twist, however, came in a way Lena could never have foreseen. That afternoon, while the girl was dozing, Veronica entered Richard's office. She wasn't there by chance. For days, a suspicion had been gnawing at her. The girl's sudden illness, Eleanor's frightened glance, the way Lena seemed to observe her, all put her on high alert. Veronica knew that control of her new and vast estate depended on maintaining the image of a perfect family. Any crack in that facade could compromise her plans. With the precision of an investigator, she began to search. She didn't know what exactly, but her instinct told her something was off. Her eyes swept the desk, the drawers, until once again they settled on the bookshelf. This time, she didn't hesitate. She pulled out the fairy tale book, the object that represented the one thing she couldn't replace, the memory of Lena's mother. She flipped through the pages with disdain until the small folded paper fell into her lap. Reading the simple, childish words, an icy smile formed on Veronica's lips. It wasn't a smile of victory, but of contempt. The child's pathetic attempt to communicate with her father infuriated her. But she was intelligent. She knew that rage was a tool to be used with precision. Destroying the note was the first, most obvious action. She shredded it into tiny pieces and tossed them into the waste bin. But that wasn't enough. She needed to destroy the girl's hope, confuse her, make her doubt her own perception of reality. The next day, Veronica entered Lena's room with a velvet box in her hands. "I have a gift for you," she said, with a sweetness that sent a shiver down Lena's spine. Inside the box, resting on a satin cushion, was a delicate gold necklace with a small angel pendant. Lena gasped. It was her mother's necklace, the jewelry she wore every day, and that had been put away after her passing. "Your father and I talked," Veronica lied, placing the necklace around the girl's neck. "We decided it's time for you to have it. We are a family now, Lena. A real family." The girl touched the gold angel, the cold metal against her skin. The gesture, which should have been one of love, filled her with overwhelming confusion. The woman who humiliated her was now giving her most cherished possession. Speaking of togetherness, the note. Had her father read it? Had he told Veronica? Or was this all just another piece in a cruel game she couldn't understand? Her mother's necklace, once a symbol of love and memory, now felt like a shackle, binding her even more firmly to that web of lies. The weight of the necklace on Lena's neck was a constant contradiction. The small gold angel, which once represented her mother's unconditional love, had now become a symbol of Veronica's manipulation. Confusion settled in her child's heart. Had the stepmother discovered the note? Had her father told her, asking her to make amends? Or was it all part of an even more elaborate plan to isolate her? Lena clung to the last flicker of hope. Perhaps her father was testing Veronica, waiting for a slip-up. She needed to speak with him, to hear from his own mouth what was happening. The opportunity seemed impossible, as Richard was on another trip, this time across the ocean. Managing his global ventures and ensuring the cash flow of his empire continued to swell. The time difference made communication difficult, but not impossible. Lena knew her father usually called by video around 9 o'clock every night to say goodnight. It was a quick ritual, often interrupted by assistants or other business calls, but it was her only window for direct contact. That night, she prepared herself. Veronica, as always, was present during the call, sitting next to Lena on the bed, her hand resting on the girl's shoulder in a show of affection for the camera. Richard appeared on the screen, his face tired but smiling. He was in a luxurious hotel suite, the skyline of a foreign city gleaming behind him. "How are my two girls?" he asked, his voice slightly distorted by the connection. Veronica answered first, reporting the lovely activities of the day, painting a picture of domestic harmony. Lena waited for a pause, her heart pounding. "Daddy," she began, her voice a little shaky, I wanted to ask you something." Veronica's gaze sharpened instantly. Her smile remained, but her fingers tightened on Lena's shoulder with a force that made her wince. "What is it, my angel?" Richard asked, his attention finally focused on her. "It's about the necklace," Lena continued, choosing her words carefully. "And I wanted to know if..." At that exact instant, Veronica's hand moved, and with a quick, seemingly accidental gesture, the tablet holding the call slipped from its stand and crashed to the floor. The screen went black. "Oh, how clumsy of me!" Veronica exclaimed, with perfectly staged frustration. "I think it broke. And the signal was so bad anyway, wasn't it? These connection problems are terrible." She picked up the device, pressing a few buttons. "I can't call back. What a shame. You talk to your father tomorrow, sweetheart." The naturalness with which she executed the act was terrifying. Lena was paralyzed. The words stuck in her throat. The door to the truth had been slammed in her face, literally and figuratively. The feeling of imprisonment had never been so intense. The mansion, with its sprawling spaces, seemed to shrink around her. The walls were not just stone. They were made of lies, control, and her father's complicit silence. She was on an island, and the only bridge to the mainland had been deliberately destroyed. The hope the note had ignited now turned into despair. Her small acts of resistance seemed useless against Veronica's cunning. The stepmother was an experienced player, anticipating her every move, turning every attempted attack into an advantage for herself. Lena huddled in bed, the angel necklace cold against her skin. She realized she wasn't just fighting cruelty, but a cold, calculating intelligence that always seemed one step ahead. The night wore on, bringing a new wave of rain that beat against the windows, an echo of the storm brewing within her small heart. She wondered what else Veronica would be capable of doing to maintain control. The answer would come sooner and more devastatingly than she could imagine. The following week was a silent escalation of tension. Veronica, after the phone incident, intensified her surveillance, masking it as excessive zeal and affection. She controlled Lena's meals, reading materials, and even her playtime in the garden, always present, always smiling. It was a gilded cage, where the bars were made of silk and the guards offered fresh orange juice. The peak of her social performance was scheduled for the following Saturday, a high-profile charity dinner she would host at the estate. It would be a grand event, bringing together the city's elite, people whose fortunes and net worth were subjects of society columns. It was the perfect opportunity for Veronica to solidify her position as the new, impeccable lady of the house, the devoted wife of the multi-millionaire Richard, a woman of class and generosity. For Lena, however, the approaching event brought a dark premonition, a certainty that something terrible was about to happen. On the night of the dinner, the mansion was transformed. The silent corridors now buzzed with white-gloved servers, florists arranging rare orchids, and the muffled sound of a chamber orchestra tuning its instruments in the ballroom. Veronica was radiant in a designer gown, moving among the guests with rehearsed grace, receiving compliments on the decor, the menu, the perfection of every detail. Lena was dressed in a blue velvet dress, her hair in an elaborate style. and instructed to smile and be polite. She felt like an accessory, another item in the luxurious decor, a testament to the family's supposed happiness. The girl tried to remain invisible, watching the adults discuss investments, treasury funds, and the latest stock market surge. Wealth was the language of the night, and she didn't speak a single word of it. The moment she dreaded arrived during the main course. Lena, nervous under the scrutiny of so many strangers, ate with redoubled caution, but her small hand, reaching for her water glass, accidentally knocked over a glass of red wine, which spilled onto the linen tablecloth, exactly as it had on the night that started everything. The ensuing silence was instantaneous. All conversations ceased. Eyes turned toward the red stain that slowly spread across the white fabric, an open wound on the night's perfection. Veronica's face was instantly transfigured. The mask of the amiable hostess fell, revealing for a second a glacial fury, but she recovered it with the speed of a seasoned actress. With a theatrical sigh of disappointment, she stood up. "Ah, Lena," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear, laced with false patience. "We talked about this, didn't we? About respect, about care. It seems you need a more effective reminder." In front of dozens of shocked guests, the humiliation unfolded in slow motion. Veronica picked up Lena's plate and, with a firmness that allowed no contestation, guided her across the ballroom. "The rules are for everyone," she declared to the astonished audience, "and discipline is the greatest proof of love we can give our children." She opened the large glass door that led to the garden, where, with a cruel irony of fate, a soft rain had begun to fall, exactly like that first night. "You will finish your dinner out here, where you can reflect on your actions." She forced Lena to kneel on the wet grass, the plate in her trembling hands, the velvet dress beginning to soak up the cold moisture. The girl did not cry. She only looked at the closed glass door, at the silhouettes of the guests watching her as if attending a theater performance. The punishment, once private and secret, was now a public spectacle. Veronica's cruelty no longer needed to hide in the shadows. It was displayed under the party lights. What neither Lena nor Veronica knew was that, outside the gates of the mansion, a black car had just parked, and the man who was stepping out of it, returning early from his trip, was about to witness the final act of that macabre play. Richard had closed the deal with a firm handshake. The glow of the Frankfurt skyline reflected in the panoramic windows of his temporary office. The transaction had been a success, a strategic move that would add several more millions of euros to his already billionaire fortune. He was a master in his universe, a world of numbers, risk analysis, and exponential profits. His businesses thrived, his stocks soared, and his capital multiplied with almost mathematical efficiency. Tired but satisfied, he made an impulsive decision. He would take the next flight home. A rare but sharp pang of missing Lena amidst his daily grind of negotiations had hit him. He wanted to surprise her, surprise everyone. He imagined the scene. He would walk into the middle of the gala dinner Veronica had orchestrated with such finesse, the multimillionaire husband returning triumphant. It would be the final touch to the perfect evening his wife had surely planned. The car dropped him off in front of the mansion's imposing gates. Golden lights streamed from the windows, and the soft melody of a violin floated in the damp night air. Instead of using the main entrance, Richard decided to walk through the side garden. He wanted to peek through the ballroom window, to savor for a moment that image of perfection he had built, the greatest of all his assets. He observed the scene through the glass, the elegant guests, the crystal glasses glistening, and Veronica at the center of it all, a queen in her castle, beautiful and in control. A proud smile touched his lips. Everything was exactly as it should be. His gaze, however, was drawn to a movement in the darkness of the garden, a small anomaly in the perfect picture. He frowned, straining his eyes to understand what the dark shape was on the grass, under the light rain that was beginning to fall. Then he saw it. The air seemed to be sucked from his lungs. Reality folded, shattering into 1,000 pieces before his eyes. It wasn't a shadow, it wasn't a stain. It was a child, kneeling, with a plate of food in her hands. His brain, accustomed to processing complex data and identifying patterns in volatile markets, simply refused to accept the information. This made no sense. It didn't fit any logic. But then the figure lifted her face, and the weak house light illuminated her features. Lena, small, soaked, shivering with cold, humiliated under the gaze of an entire party. The shock was a wave of ice that ran down his spine, paralyzing every muscle. He stood immobile, the leather briefcase containing multi-million-dollar contracts slipping from his hand and falling onto the wet grass unnoticed. The proud smile on his face disintegrated, replaced by a mask of disbelief. He looked from his daughter in the garden to his wife in the ballroom, who was now laughing at something a guest had said. The juxtaposition of the two images was violent, a blow that shattered the facade of his life. The woman he admired for her elegance and discipline was the same one forcing his daughter to eat in the rain. The perfect family, the harmonious home, it was all a lie, the most disastrous investment of his life. The initial shock, the paralyzing confusion, began to transform into something different. A cold, silent, and profound fury began to rise from his gut. It wasn't the explosive rage of a betrayed man, but the calculated wrath of a billionaire who realizes he's been conned, that his most precious asset was being destroyed right under his nose. He slowly bent down, picked up his briefcase, and his eyes fixed on the front door. The world of business, dividends, and cash flow vanished. There was only one thing to be done, a score to settle, and the liability of that equation was about to be liquidated. Richard walked toward the main entrance, each step heavy with the fury that consumed him. He didn't feel the rain on his face, didn't hear the music coming from inside the house. His senses were focused on a single point, a clear and immediate objective. He opened the imposing oak door silently. The sound of the party hit him, a cacophony of laughter and conversation that seemed obscene given what he had just witnessed. No one noticed his arrival. He stood for an instant at the entrance to the ballroom, a dark and soaked figure observing the scene. Veronica was the center of attention, moving with the grace of a dancer, the impeccable smile on her face. The hypocrisy of the scene was so overwhelming that Richard felt nauseous. He had handed the key to his kingdom, the control of his home, and the trust of his daughter to a tyrant disguised as an angel. Guilt hit him with the force of a punch to the stomach. How could he have been so blind? How could he have allowed the management of his portfolio to be more important than the protection of his own blood? The first to notice him was the conductor of the small orchestra. He stopped the music mid-note, his gaze fixed on the unexpected figure in the doorway. Silence spread like a wave, one guest noticing the next, until the entire ballroom was hushed, eyes turning toward Richard. Veronica turned, and the smile on her face froze, replaced by an expression of pure shock. "Richard, darling, you're back," she stammered, desperately trying to regain control of the situation. "What a surprise. We weren't expecting you so soon." She walked toward him, her hand extended, ready to stage the role of the happy, surprised wife. But Richard didn't move. His eyes, cold as steel, stopped her halfway. "Where is my daughter?" he asked, his voice low and controlled, yet carrying a menace that sent a shiver through the ballroom. Veronica paled. Color drained from her face, leaving behind the carefully applied makeup. She tried to formulate a response, one of her well-constructed lies, but the words wouldn't come out. She was being a little stubborn, darling. A small lesson in discipline, that's all. You know how important. Richard cut her off with a gesture of his hand. "I know what I saw," he said, his voice still low but sharp. He walked slowly across the ballroom, passing her as if she didn't exist, and went to the glass door. All eyes followed him. He opened the door, and there was Lena, still kneeling, her body trembling, her face pale and wet, but her eyes wide with surprise at seeing her father. He knelt in front of her, ignoring the soaked grass that stained his expensive suit. He took off his jacket and wrapped it around her, lifting her into his arms. As he turned back to the ballroom, Lena's gaze, over her father's shoulder, met Eleanor's, the housekeeper, who was watching the scene from a corner, her hands covering her mouth, her eyes filled with tears. In that instant, something shifted. The girl, finally feeling safe, made a small gesture. Her trembling hand reached up to her neck and touched the angel necklace. She didn't say anything, but her look at her father and then at Veronica was enough. Richard understood. The necklace, the one Veronica had claimed she gave Lena as a symbol of their new family. The final lie, the missing piece in the puzzle of manipulation. Richard's rage reached a boiling point. He turned to Veronica, who was now shaking, her facade of control completely crumbled. "Explain," he commanded, the word echoing in the deathly silence of the ballroom. Veronica opened her mouth, tears beginning to well in her eyes, the last weapon in her arsenal. But before she could speak, another voice, trembling yet firm, cut through the air. "I will explain, sir." All eyes turned to the slight figure who had stepped forward, emerging from the shadows of the service corridor. It was Eleanor, the housekeeper. Her face, usually serene and discreet, was marked by anguish and newfound determination. Her hands, which had served that family for decades, were clenched by her sides. The fear that had silenced her for so long was still there, a knot in her throat. But Lena's gaze, a mixture of plea and gratitude, had given her the strength she needed. She was the silent witness, the guardian of the unspoken truths in that mansion, and her silence had become a burden too heavy to carry. Veronica glared at her, a desperate threat to silence her, but it was too late. Eleanor's loyalty was not to money or power, but to the memory of Richard's first wife and the innocence of the child she saw as a granddaughter. "It wasn't the first time," Eleanor began, her voice gaining firmness with every word. The ballroom transformed into an impromptu courtroom, the previously festive guests, now the silent jury. "Last week, little Lena became ill, running a high fever. Mrs. Veronica told you she had been playing in the rain, but it wasn't play. It was punishment. I saw it from the window. She forced her to eat out here in the rain just because a drop of sauce fell on the cloth." A shocked murmur swept through the room. Veronica's image of perfection began to crack, the thin lacquer peeling away to reveal the cruelty beneath. Eleanor continued, the flow of words now uncontrollable. A torrent of suppressed truths. "The girl tried to tell you. She hid a note in one of your books, but Mrs. Veronica found it first and destroyed it." Richard held Lena tightly, his heart breaking with every revelation. He looked at the storybook on his shelf, the book he hadn't opened in years, and guilt consumed him. "And the phone call," Eleanor continued, her gaze fixed on Richard. "When she tried to tell you over the phone, the madam knocked the tablet down on purpose. It was all staged, all to keep the girl silent, to keep her isolated." Eleanor's confession was the final hammer blow that shattered the glass facade of Richard's life. The embarrassment in the ballroom was palpable. The guests, formerly passive accomplices to the spectacle of humiliation, now looked away, uncomfortable witnessing the public exposure of such hypocrisy. The party had become a nightmare. The mansion's luxury now seemed vulgar and hollow in the face of the raw truth that had been exposed. Veronica, cornered, with no more lies left to tell, attempted her last resort, desperate denial. "This is absurd. She is lying," she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Eleanor. "This old woman is making it all up. She probably wants more money. A raise. Richard, darling, you won't believe her, will you? You'll believe a servant over your wife." The question hung in the air, weighted with arrogance and desperation, but Richard was no longer looking at her. His gaze was fixed on Lena. He saw the relief on his daughter's face, the way she nestled into his arms, the security she finally felt. He saw the truth in Eleanor's tear-filled eyes, a woman who had known him since childhood and had never given him reason to doubt her word. And then he looked at Veronica, and for the first time, he saw her as she truly was, a stranger, a predator who had infiltrated his home, a woman whose sole interest was access to his vast fortune, his assets, and the status his name provided. The decision was already made. The trial concluded. All that remained was to pronounce the sentence. The sentence came, not with a cry of rage, but with the cutting coldness of a business transaction being terminated. Richard lifted his gaze from his daughter and fixed it on Veronica. Love, or what he thought was love, had evaporated, leaving behind only the bitter residue of betrayal. The man who amassed a fortune by investing in stocks, who understood the value of every asset and the risk of every liability, finally saw the greatest miscalculation of his life. Veronica was not an asset. She was a toxic debt that was destroying his most precious possession. "It's over. Veronica," he said, his voice resonating in the sepulchral silence of the ballroom. The three words, simple and direct, had the impact of a physical blow. Veronica recoiled, as if struck. "What? Richard, no, don't do this," she pleaded. The tears now genuine, but not of remorse, but of loss. The loss of luxury, status, and unrestricted access to his financial empire. "You turned my home into a prison. You humiliated my daughter," Richard continued, his tone unchanged, which made it all the more terrifying. He approached her, Lena still safe in his arms. "You took her mother's memory," he said, pointing to the angel necklace, "and turned it into a weapon. There is nothing you can say, nothing you can do. Our marriage, if it ever was real, ends here, now." He turned to the guests, who remained frozen in their seats. "The party is over. I ask that you leave." No one needed to be told twice. In a silent, embarrassed exodus, the ballroom emptied, leaving behind only the protagonists of that family drama. The servers vanished, the music ceased, and the house plunged into a tense silence, broken only by the sound of rain outside. Richard gently placed Lena on the floor and held her hand. He looked at Eleanor, apology and immense gratitude in his eyes. The housekeeper merely nodded, tears streaming down her face. Then he turned to Veronica one last time. She stood in the middle of the luxurious ballroom, the expensive dress now looking like a misplaced costume. "I want you to pack your things and leave this house. Tonight," he ordered. "But where will I go?" she whispered, desperation seizing her voice. "That is no longer my concern," Richard replied. He then did something that sealed the fate of that night with cruel, poetic symmetry. He walked to the glass door, opened it, and held it. The rain was falling harder now, the cold wind sweeping into the ballroom. "You wanted so badly to teach a lesson about the value of things," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Perhaps it's your turn to learn." He escorted her to the door, and Veronica, defeated, without further arguments, walked out into the dark garden, the same garden where, minutes earlier, Lena had been kneeling. The rain began to soak her perfectly styled hair and stain her designer gown. She turned, a final plea in her eyes, but Richard closed the glass door, leaving her outside. He felt no pleasure in it. There was no vengeance in his heart, only a cold emptiness. Lena, watching the scene, expressed no triumph. She only looked at the silhouette of the woman in the rain, a lonely and pathetic figure. In her small heart, there was no room for hatred. There was only a profound sadness for all the unnecessary suffering. Justice had been done, but there was no joy in the victory. There was only the silent hope that, from that moment on, the rain could finally wash away the pain and purify the house. In the days that followed that tempestuous night, the mansion underwent a subtle yet profound transformation. It wasn't a change in the opulent decor or the meticulously maintained gardens, but in the atmosphere. The tense silence, which had previously hung like a cold mist, was gradually replaced by a serene quietude. It was as if the house itself, a witness to so much veiled pain, could finally breathe. Richard, the billionaire accustomed to commanding empires from glass-walled boardrooms, cancelled all his trips. He delegated important meetings, postponed multi-million-dollar deals, and ignored the fluctuations of the stock market. For the first time in many years, his main investment was time. Time for his daughter, time to rebuild the bridge that his negligence and blindness had allowed to crumble. Guilt was Richard's constant companion. He saw Veronica's cruelty in every corner of the house, in every memory of the past months. He saw it in Lena's persistent paleness, in the way she still flinched at a loud step in the hallway. He knew that erasing the scars would take more than just the aggressor's absence. It would require presence, patience, and above all, love. The journey of rapprochement began in the kitchen, a territory Richard barely knew. Accustomed to private chefs and award-winning restaurants, he found himself clumsy by the stove, trying to make pancakes from a recipe he found online. The first attempt burned, filling the kitchen with smoke and setting off the fire alarm. Lena, instead of being startled, let out a genuine laugh. The first Richard had heard in a very long time. The sound was more valuable to him than any profit or dividend he had ever received. They began to create new rituals. Richard learned that Lena liked hot chocolate with a dash of cinnamon and that she hated the crusts on bread. He discovered she had an incredible talent for drawing small birds and that her favorite color was the blue of twilight. These were small, trivial details, but they formed a father's true portfolio, a wealth he had almost lost forever. One afternoon, while organizing his office, removing the last vestiges of Veronica, he picked up the blue hardback fairy tale book. He sat beside Lena on the sofa and, his voice slightly choked, began to read the story of the Firebird, the same one her mother used to read. Lena leaned her head against his shoulder and they read together, the story becoming a link between the painful past, the healing present, and the hopeful future. Eleanor, the housekeeper, watched the transformation with silent relief. She had become an even more central figure in their lives, a surrogate grandmother offering warm cakes and comforting hugs. The rigid hierarchy of the house dissolved, giving way to a warmer, more genuine family dynamic. The mansion's luxury remained, the artwork, the designer furniture, the gleam of the marble, but now it served only as a backdrop, a frame for something infinitely rarer and more precious, peace. Richard's fortune had not diminished. In fact, his businesses continued to prosper under his team's command. But his definition of wealth had changed forever. It was no longer in profitability charts or gold prices. It was in his daughter's laughter, in the warmth of her small hand holding his, in the certainty that he was building a home and not just managing a collection of assets. The storm had passed, and in place of injustice, the seed of a new beginning slowly sprouted. The rebuilding journey, however, was not a straight line. There were days when a fleeting shadow crossed Lena's face, an echo of past humiliations. Once, during lunch, she spilled a little juice on the table. The girl's body instantly stiffened, her eyes widened in panic, and she began to apologize profusely, ready to stand up and accept punishment. Richard felt a pang in his heart. He stood up, grabbed a napkin, and instead of scolding her, deliberately spilled a little of his own juice beside it. "Oops, I guess I'm clumsy today too," he said with a gentle smile. "I think we'll have to clean this up together." Lena watched him, the tension in her shoulders slowly easing, a small smile appearing on her lips. In that moment, she learned not only that accidents happen, but that love is patient and forgiveness, unconditional. The angel necklace, a symbol of so much pain and manipulation, was put away. It wasn't thrown out, but placed in a small music box that had belonged to her mother. One day, Richard explained, she would be able to look at it and remember not Veronica's lie, but her mother's love and the strength she herself had shown. The house, formerly a stage for Veronica's tyranny, began to be filled with their memories. They transformed the formal dining room, the scene of so many silent, tense meals, into a game room with a large rug on the floor where they assembled giant puzzles. The garden, once a place of punishment, became a refuge. Richard, the man who negotiated multi-million-dollar assets, learned to plant sunflowers with his daughter, getting his hands dirty and discovering a satisfaction no closed deal had ever given him. One of the most significant moments of this transformation occurred about 2 weeks after Veronica's departure. Richard received a call from his lawyers. Veronica, through her representatives, was demanding a substantial portion of his estate, claiming emotional distress and breach of prenuptial agreement. The old Richard would have entered a legal war, mobilizing his army of attorneys to protect every cent of his capital. But the new Richard merely sighed. He instructed his lawyers to offer her a generous but final settlement. "But I don't want any more battles," he said over the phone. "I want peace." He wasn't giving up his fortune out of weakness, but out of strength. He understood that a man's true net worth is not measured in dollars or bitcoins, but in the tranquility of his spirit. Fighting Veronica would mean keeping her toxic energy close, and he was unwilling to pay that price. That night, he told Lena, simply and carefully, about the agreement. "The woman who lived here will no longer be a part of our lives, my angel, in any way." He expected to see relief or joy on her face, but Lena was silent for a moment, thoughtful. "Daddy," she said softly, "I hope she finds a way to be happy, for real." The girl's capacity for forgiveness, her empathy for the one who had caused her so much harm, left Richard speechless. It was the final, most powerful lesson. Arrogance builds mansions, but innocence and forgiveness sustain a home. He hugged his daughter tightly, the tears he hadn't cried on the night of the confrontation finally coming to his eyes. They were tears of sadness for all the lost time, but also of overwhelming gratitude for the second chance that life, Tyr, and his courageous daughter had granted him. The healing process was complete, not with the Punisher's retribution, but with the liberation from resentment. The months that followed were like the seasons, each bringing a new color to the landscape of that house and those lives. The summer of healing gave way to an autumn of rediscovery. Richard and Lena built a new world for themselves, a world whose foundations were not made of concrete and steel, but of trust and affection. Richard's vast fortune, his investments, and international businesses continued to be managed by his competent team. But for him, it had become background noise, the distant soundtrack of a life he no longer inhabited. His reality now was the smell of chocolate cake baking in the oven, courtesy of Eleanor, and the sound of Lena's laughter echoing through the corridors that were once silent. He learned to tie her hair in a clumsy ponytail, to help her with her homework, and most importantly, to listen. He listened not only to her words but to her silences, learning to read the emotions in her expressive eyes. The final arc of Richard's healing came on a rainy afternoon, very different from those that marked the beginning of their suffering. He was in the attic, searching for old photo albums, when he found a locked wooden box. It was his first wife's memory box, a sanctuary he had kept untouched for years, fearing the pain opening it might bring. But now, he felt it was time. He brought the box down to the living room, where Lena was drawing near the fireplace. "I think there's something here that belongs to you," he said softly. Together, they opened the box. Inside, there were photographs, a diary in her mother's elegant handwriting, dried flowers, and the small music box. Richard opened it, and inside, on the faded velvet, was the angel necklace. Lena looked at it, and for the first time there was no shadow of fear or confusion in her eyes. She picked up the necklace delicately and held it in her palm. "It's beautiful," she said, with a simplicity that disarmed Richard. "Mom had a good heart, didn't she, Daddy?" He nodded, his throat tight. "She had the best heart of all." Lena then turned to him and, with a wisdom far beyond her 10 years, added, "She wouldn't want you to be sad. She would want to see us happy, like this." In that instant, the last ghost of guilt haunting Richard dissipated. The absolution he sought did not come from the heavens, but from his daughter's voice. She was healed, and in healing herself, she had healed him too. Eleanor, who entered the room carrying a tray of tea, stopped and smiled at the scene. Richard looked at her and said, "Thank you, Eleanor, for everything. You are no longer an employee to us. You are family." The tears of joy the housekeeper shed sealed the conclusion of her own arc of courage and loyalty. Lena placed the necklace back in the box, along with the other mementos. As she did, her fingers touched something at the bottom, beneath the velvet lining. It was a time-yellowed, sealed envelope. Carefully, Richard picked it up. On the front, in the same handwriting as the diary, was written in slightly faded letters, "To my dearest Lena." "To be read when you need me the most," Richard gasped. His late wife somehow had reached across time, leaving a final message, a last testament of love. He looked at Lena, whose eyes were wide with astonishment and expectation. The pain of the past was resolved, the present was peaceful, but the future suddenly contained one final, emotional mystery, a voice from beyond waiting to be heard. With slightly trembling hands, Richard handed the envelope to Lena. It was hers, an inheritance of love that transcended time. Lena held the antique paper with an almost sacred reverence, the wax seal with her mother's initials still intact. The crackling of the fire in the fireplace and the soft sound of rain on the window were the only noises in the world. Together, father and daughter sat on the rug, and with infinite delicacy, Lena broke the seal. Inside, there was a single folded sheet of paper. The handwriting was fluid and full of love, each letter a testament to her mother's spirit. Richard began to read aloud, his voice choked but firm. "My dearest Lena, my little angel, if you are reading this letter, it is because life has taken a path neither of us wished for, and I am not there to hold your hand." The first lines were a balm for wounds they didn't even know still existed. The letter was not a sad goodbye, but a celebration of life and a guide for the future. "I want you to know that love does not disappear, my daughter. It transforms. It lives in memories, in smiles, in the kindness we spread throughout the world. And my love for you is the most real and lasting thing I have ever created. It is in the sun that warms your face, in the rain that makes the flowers grow, and in the stars that watch over your sleep." Lena leaned her head on her father's shoulder, absorbing every word. The letter spoke of courage, the importance of being true to herself, and the strength found in kindness. "There will be times when you feel alone or afraid. In those moments, I ask you to remember this. The greatest wealth anyone can have is not in money, assets, or houses. It is in the love we give and receive. Be brave, my love. Be kind, even when it is difficult. And, above all, never let the darkness of others extinguish your light." The last part of the letter was addressed to both of them. "And to you, my beloved Richard," the letter continued, and Richard's voice cracked for an instant. "Take care of our girl. Teach her about the world, but also learn from her about the heart. The greatest of all inheritances we can leave is not funds or stocks, but the values we plant in our children's souls. Build a home full of laughter, not rules. May the dinner table be a place of sharing, not silence, and never forget to dance in the rain together. Upon finishing the reading, father and daughter were embracing, tears flowing freely, not of sadness, but of a deep and cathartic emotion. The letter was the final piece, the resolution that united past, present, and future. It was the permission to be happy, the blessing to move forward. That night, the mansion was no longer a symbol of wealth or pain. It was a home. The luxury that once seemed cold and imposing was now merely the setting for a story of resilience and rediscovered love. The message that arrogance can build mansions, but only innocence sustains a home, had manifested in its purest form. The final scene of that journey unfolded a few days later. A new rain was falling, but this time it was a rain of renewal. Richard and Lena stood on the porch, holding hands, watching the drops dance on the garden leaves. They didn't shrink away, they didn't hide. Instead, they laughed. They extended their hands to feel the fresh water, a symbolic baptism. No one was being punished, no one was alone. The pain had been washed away. Justice, in the end, was not about revenge, but about restoration. And as they looked out at the rain, father and daughter together felt that the sky was not crying. It was simply clearing the path for a new dawn.